Hello everybody, welcome to my continuing coverage of the 2013 U.S. Chess League for the Arizona Scorpions. This is Steve Farmer. For those of you who follow my blog on chess.com, thank you very much. I got 460 views since last week, which is pretty awesome, so thank you all. I try and make these informative and fun. The person who commented on my blog last week was none other than Lev Altounian, whose game we are going to cover in this video because it was a magnificent game. And he's asked me the question, why does everybody always predict I draw? Well, it's not that he draws because he wants to draw. He wants to win, of course. He's not crazy. He's a very strong player. It's just he's on board 2, and a lot of teams will switch their board 1 and board 2, and they try and match their best up against who's going to be playing Lev, because Lev is very hard to beat. So they want to always try and get somebody that they think can beat him. And when he draws all the time, that's a credit. You know, that's saying something. And the thing is it's hard to beat Lev. That's why draws happen. It's not that Lev has a passion for draws, but he does win. And we're going to see a beautiful game here from Lev. So thank you all the viewers, and thank you, Lev, for commenting on the blog. It's all in fun. Okay, so just a quick recap to bring you up to date on what's going on in the league. Arizona in week 1 drew their match against the Seattle Sluggers. And that was upsetting because Pedro Matufi, I think, could have won his game if I recall correctly, and that would have given the win to Arizona. But missed chances, and they ended up drawing the match. And then 2 weeks in a row, the Scorpions went down in flames. In week 2, they lost to the San Francisco Mechanics 3.5 to 1/2. And that score is a bit slanted, but you know, when you try too hard to win in drawn positions, you end up losing them a lot of times, and that's what happened against San Francisco. In week 3, Arizona went down to the Dallas Destiny, which could have gone either way by a score of 2.5 to 1.5. I thought it should have been a drawn match, but as it turned out, Arizona came up on the short end of that. So Arizona's been in the fight for all their matches, but they've had a really rough start to this season. However, in week 4, we got into some intra-division contests, and it was East meets West. And Arizona came out on top of the Manhattan Applesauce by a score of 2.5 to 1.5. And that was an interesting battle because on board 1, Mackenzie Molnar was facing Conrad Holt. And that was a pretty theoretical game, a very interesting game, in a Sicilian Najdorf with Bishop E2, E5 by black. A very interesting game, but it ended up being a draw. I think black was slightly better at the point of the draw, but I don't think there was any need to play on because Conrad had a solid position with white. On board 2, well, that is the game we're going to look at. This is a masterpiece in my opinion. Sure, there are some errors in this game which takes it away from being the game of the week. Plus, who gives the game of the week to a game that has a queenless middle game? And you might think it's boring, but I think once you learn to appreciate queenless middle games and then have to use all your other forces, you're going to find that your rating will improve because with the absence of queens, you have to make all your pieces work in unison. Now, if you are able to make all your pieces work in unison without the queens, imagine what you can do with them. So, you know, the game of the week usually goes to something flashy, as it did last week and this week as well. On board 3, we had a really, really nice slugfest between Goldenberg playing white against Robbie Adamson, and it was a Najdorf as well. And black had, had his chances in that one too. It's a shame because, you're playing at such a fast time control that it's difficult to make really critical decisions when you don't have much time. And the Najdorf is one of those that's really complex, yet it's very forgiving. You can make a mistake and still come back in a Najdorf. In a lot of positional openings, you can't make a mistake and come back. But the Najdorf is rather forgiving, and that was an interesting game. And if I have time, I'll post a video of that, but I will definitely post the analysis on the blog for all of you to look at. And then in the final game of the match was Amanda Mateer for Arizona, who is turning out to be the not-so-secret weapon for Arizona. She's scored well this season, and she racked up another point here against Manhattan. So with the way that East meets West battles turned out in Week 4, we're concerned with the Pacific Division in the Western Conference. So the Pacific Division is San Francisco, Arizona, Los Angeles, and Seattle. And miraculously, Arizona is in second place in the Pacific Division. San Francisco has 3 wins and 1 loss. Arizona has 1.5 wins, 2.5 losses. So, you know, we're still far away from first place, but we have a chance of qualifying if we keep racking up the points. Now, Los Angeles, who they will meet in this upcoming battle on the 24th, they have 1 win and 3 loss matches, and then taking up last place is Seattle with a 0.5 point out of 4. Now, the race between 2nd through 4th is very close. So Arizona is going to have to absolutely run the board here and win the rest of the matches, or at least tie with the lower ranked ones. They can't afford any lost matches. Well, maybe one, and then they'd still have to have the gods intervene here. But if they win out, they should be able to do okay. And if they draw a match with San Francisco, that should be fine too, because I think San Francisco is on a tear. Okay, so that's the match setup. Let's turn our attention to the game here. And we're going to go through the opening rather quickly because Lev likes to play openings that are not totally standard. Queen A4 check. And the reason is he wants to get the playing chess right away. Queen to H4. Bishop C6, and now Queen to D4 is a nice move. Okay. A little bit of binding going on already here by White. He's made 3 queen moves in a row, but now Black has to deal with some weak dark squares on his king side. And how do you deal with that? With F6, so that maybe you can castle? Well, then that makes your light and dark squares weak around your king. So that's not really an option. Lev's opponent in this is Eli Vovsha, a strong player for Manhattan. And he goes rook to G8 here. Lev throws in knight to E5, hitting that bishop. E6, E4, hitting the knight, gaining some space. Knight to B4, and this welcomes a queen trade, and I don't think that that's any concern to Lev at all. So he takes, and king to D1. Now, I think that if somebody was to walk by the board at this point and not seen the preceding moves, they would say, well, they set up the board wrong. Nope, this is what really happened in the game. So bishop E8, a lovely pair of bishops there, right? D4, grabbing more center, and knight to D7. Now, surprisingly, this position has been seen before by some notable players, and they continued with knight to D3 here. Lev opts for the road less traveled and goes for knight to F3. Lev is calm in such positions. He's behind in development, technically speaking, but he's ahead in development from a practical standpoint, because Black's pieces all stand on some very ugly squares. So even though technically you'd say, oh well, the only piece that Black really has not developed, actually there's 2 of them, is his queen rook and his king bishop, whereas White has to develop both bishops, both rooks. But that's not really the case. That's deceptive. Now, I think that Eli should do something more constructive with the position here and play a move like C5. It may look dangerous, but there's no queens on the board. The idea is you want to open up the position for your bishop pair. However, he opts to play bishop to G7. Lev throws in a spike check. Bishop E3 straight away is probably more accurate, but this little check is designed to force F6 or to have the king go to C8. So Eli throws in F6, and now the bishop goes to where it wanted to be, and G5. trying to find a home for his awkward bishop on e8. You know, maybe it can come to g6 and have some impact in the game. a3, pushing the knight back, and then king to c2. Now, I give this move an exclamation mark. I suppose bishop c4 was equally good, but I like to move king to c2, and we start to get some insight into Lev's thinking here. He once told me that he was a big fan of Tigran Petrosian, and Tigran was a very practical and positional player. Very strong, very strong. Very hard to beat, like Lev is. So we can see where Lev picks up his traits from. So we get to see how a strong player handles a position like this, where he has an edge, and he's just going to keep pushing forward with that edge. Never give black anything. That's his goal throughout the game. Bishop g6 was played, improving the bishop. Rook to d1. Knight to b6. It finally looks like black's starting to work his way out of trouble here. Bishop d3. White completes his development. Knight to e7. I think this is really designed against letting d5 come in from white. But white now switches gears a little bit. I was predicting he would play g4 here, but he played h4, allowing g4, and then knight d2, and then h5. Okay. Black, I don't want to say he solved his opening problems, because his king's still stuck in the center, and though he's gained space on the king's side, I think that's really inconsequential to what's going on with the game. Lev brings more wood to the fire on the queen's side with knight to b3 and now knight to d7. I'm not too sure about black's moves here. And now bishop c4. You know, there might have been some merit to bring the king to b1 to a2 or to a1 to get out of the crossfire here. But Lev wants to get in the move d5 as quickly as possible and run that pawn up the board as fast as he can. So that's what he's basing his battle on here. The problem with this move is that black had a resource here that he could have tried and he missed it. In the game he played bishop to f7. Now I have no idea what the time situation was for the players in this game. I think that Eli still had plenty of time to think, and he might have been able to crawl back into the game with a rather surprising knight to d5. If he can trade off some pieces, he's going to ease his defense quite a bit. The first thing you got to notice here simply is that the pawn on e4 is pinned and cannot take the knight. That's what makes this work. And I think that white's best move here is just simply move the bishop back. I don't think there's really a need to trade off the bishops here. It just doesn't make sense to me. And then try knight to c5. And then rook to e8. Now the pressures come in under white's central pawn mass. So taking the pawn on b7 really doesn't make a lot of sense if you're going to lose a central one. So take on d5 and b6. Now knight f4. And believe it or not, I think that although it's a bit crazy of a position right now, the pawn on e4 is going to fall eventually. And with that, I think black gets equality here. However, if we go back after knight to d5, the move I recommend, Lev could just play bishop to d2. And then after knight to c3, take with the king. If you take with the bishop, he just takes here, check. And black is probably even a bit better here. So king takes c3. The point here is if bishop takes e4 now, then we have bishop takes e6 hitting the rook, rook e8, bishop f7 hitting the rook and the pawn, bishop takes g2, and then rook h e1. And I think white holds a slight edge here. And going back here where white played king takes c3, if rook to e8, I think that white's just got a pleasant position here. He can play moves like f3, protect the pawn on e4 if he wants. I think white's doing okay. Definitely a lot more coordinated than black is. Okay, so that was at this position here. He could have played knight to d5. Instead he played bishop f7, and now Lev throws the wood up the board with d5. This is actually the winning move, folks. Hard to believe, but this is a winning move. From this point on, Eli starts to falter. Again, I don't know their time situation, but he certainly did not play the position well from here, and this is why this game fell out of contention for game of the week. I think his best shot here is with pawn takes pawn, knight takes, bishop takes, and rook takes. Though even here, I think that white has a winning advantage. Now we can see that black's advance on the king side was a bit premature with his pawns, as they are now tender. And white is threatening to simply just play rook hd1 and pick up a piece. So white's doing very well here. But he's doing a little better after e5. Now knight to a5 and king to c8. Let's take a step back. Nobody wants to give up a pawn in a tough position, but let's look at an alternative here. Knight to c8. At least this is what the computer was giving as being the best chance. Knight takes pawn is with check, king to e7, and now d6. And after knight takes d6, bishop takes f7. Now there's a couple choices here. If knight takes b7, we take the rook. If knight takes f7, we go knight to d5 check, king f8, and knight takes c7. This is winning for white. It's pretty fugly for black, as a matter of fact. And if king takes f7, then we take on d6 with knight. It's check, takes, and rook takes. Against any strong player, this is just losing for black. White has an extra pawn. It's a queenside pawn away from the black king, and white has active pieces. He has pressure on the a7 pawn with a move like rook a6, going after that pawn straight away if he wanted. Black is in pretty bad shape here. But when we go back to this position here, that is what the computer is recommending as the best idea. In the game, Eli played king to c8. And now, I think Lev should have played knight to b5 here. At least that's what I was predicting. Let's just take a look at it, just to ruffle people's feathers here. Let's take a look at knight to b5. Now, if b6 chase away the knight, we take on c7. And here's the point to this. If he plays king takes c7, then d6, and all of a sudden everything in black's camp is just hanging. King to d8, we take on f7, rook moves, and now we can take the knight if we want, but we can throw in the check. If king c8, now we take here. And the point of this move order is if rook takes, then we go here, check, and pick up the rook, and save the knight. Okay, so back here, instead of taking the knight on c7, if he takes the knight on a5, then we have knight takes a8, king to b7 to try and at least get the knight out of the deal. Bishop b5, hitting the knight on d7, drops the knight back, knight to c7. Now if he takes, we got d6 regaining the material, so rook to c8 and d6 just holds on to the knight. Should be a pretty easy win for white. So that was my option that I was looking at during the game. Lev played d6. And when I looked at this, I go, yeah, that's pretty strong too. So that just shows you how strong white's position was without the queens on the board. This gives black a chance to trade some material to try and ease his cramped nature, but this doesn't really help him too much because it brings the knight in to protect the pawn on d6. Knight to c6 was played, and now he plays knight to b5, which is a slight inaccuracy. I didn't see this at the time, but d takes c7 is the best move. Let's take a look at that. This is a computer's line. King takes c7, now knight to b5. And if king to d8, we have rook to d3. We're going to try and double on that file real quick, as we do. And then he covers the knight, and now knight d to c6. Now we're threatening to take on b7, and we're threatening knight to f5, just gaining a dominating position. So knight to b8, And now we can take on a7. White just dominates the entire board. So going back here after knight to b5 check, you can go king to c8. Then we got knight checks, king goes to b8, knight to f5, knight to b6, bishop takes knight, pawn takes bishop, rook to d7, threatening to win the bishop. So now, if bishop to f8, we go b4. And black is just getting tied up here. Rook h8, what else is there? Then we bring this rook in, and now black is either getting mated or he loses a piece. And if bishop to h8 to cover that back rank in that line, then we double up anyhow. Really, there's no useful moves for black. This was like the best I can come up with. And now knight f to d6, covering the knight. Rook to g7, we trade rooks. And now b4, chasing that rook away. Rook a6, now knight f5 again. Bishop's got to move, and rook to d7. And after king c8, rook to f7 picks off a piece. Bishop has nowhere to go. So yeah, it seems that d takes c7 is the way to go here, but that's a computer line. That's not really what humans tend to look at. But it is a very nice line. It's just the geometry of the pieces. The computer is better to evaluate those things than the human brain is. Knight to b5 was played. It's still a good move, still winning. And here, Eli plays a6. I gotta say his play has not been very impressive so far. And now he starts to get a little too passive. Of course, chasing the knight back makes a lot of sense. But, let's try and fortify the king a little and play knight to b6. Knight takes c7. Now knight takes c4. The idea is to get rid of some of these attackers, even though it costs the exchange. Yeah, I agree this looks grim for black as the exchange and a pawn down. But the rook on a8 is not nearly as important as that crazy d pawn. And after bishop f8, bishop c5, b6, d7 check, king d8, bishop takes bishop, rook takes, king c3, knight 4 to a5, b4, knight to b7, and now rook to d5. Technique should win the game for white here. Of course, his knight's still stranded on a8, but black's not going to really able to go after it. He can't get his king to c7 because of the knight, and he can't get the king to c8 because of the pawn. And anytime he moves the king to e7, the knight comes out through c7. So yeah, just good technique should win this for white. But this is definitely a better path to be played than a6. Because now knight takes c7, rook b8, and bishop to b6. Lev takes advantage of the weak dark squares around the king. Now it's easy to recommend moves for the players here at this time, but for black none of them are good. For white almost all of them are good. That's why this game was so interesting. It left a lot of opportunity to think about what should be played. This is one of those games that I think would be fun to set up on a regular board on a nice rainy evening and just study it from beginning to end and look at all the variations yourself, because there's a lot of really nice stuff in here. Alright, so here king to d8 was played, and now king to b1, bishop to f8. And if black wanted to try and get away from being suffocated here, he could have tried knight takes b6. The more material you trade, the easier a task is, right? Well, not necessarily. Knight takes on b6, and then bishop h6. At least trying to get a good diagonal for the bishop. Rook to d3, we just work around that. Now knight to d4. Interesting, huh? He's finally blocked the file that guards that d-pawn. The bad thing is that the knights pretty much cover the access to that pawn right now. So white has a very tricky way to get control of the d-file back. And this is just absolutely beautiful. Here, to get control of the d-file, he moves the rook away from the d-file. Plays rook to c3. Okay, let's go after that pawn with bishop f8. Let's protect the pawn by pushing it, now that our knight on c7 is protected by the rook on c3. But that's not the main point of the rook c3 move. Bishop h6. Okay, what else is there for black? There's really not much. You can move the h rook back and forth. That is about it. Don't want to move the knight from d5 because that's blocking the d file for the pawn on d7. If he goes king to e7 here, thinking I'll bring the rook in and round up that pawn, even though I may have to give up the rook for the pawn and the knight, that would be good, but that doesn't happen. Knight cd5, king e6, and then rook to c8. Ah, this is nasty. Ah, bishop d6 defends everything. But now rook h c1. Knight to c6 has to be played. You cannot allow rook takes either rook and then rook to c8. That just wins for white. So knight to c6. And now simply knight to e3. And white has a better version of what we will see in the game. White just dominates this position. He's probably the equivalent of being a piece up if you were to run a computer analysis on this. So let's drop back here. Instead of d7, let's go look at bishop h6. Now knight cd5. Well, we're threatening mate in 2 with rook to c8, so pretty much forced to play knight to c6 now. And guess what? Rook to d1. We're back in control of the d file once again. Isn't that beautiful? And now rook to g6, so that after knight to b4, remember we'd like to get in rook to c8, he can play f5, guarding the knight with the rook, but after e takes f5, rook f6, rook to d5, bishop g7, rook takes e5. Okay. Temporarily getting a third pawn, rook f8, but giving it right back so that after bishop takes f6, rook to f5, and now knight to e7. It looks like it defends everything, right? Guards the c8 square, hits the rook on f5, and what do we do here as white? Do we move the rook? No. Go knight 4 to d5. And white comfortably wins in this position. You might want to write this one down. I'm not going to show you all the winning continuations. It's just a quick little one. And for people 1600 or lower, I'd say write this down and look at it. Find why white is just absolutely crushing here. But take my word for it, he is. All right, let's go back to the game. King to b1 was just played by Lev, and Eli played bishop to f8 here. Knight to e6 is check, king to e8, bishop to c7 hits the rook, rook to c8, now knight to b6, and this wins the exchange. Unless black plays knight takes b6. Bishop takes b6. Now knight to b8, knight to c7 is check, king to d7, knight to d5, threatening the pawn on f6, and he pretty much has to guard it. He cannot take the d-pawn. If he takes with the king, we go here, it's discovered check with the rook on d1, and we pick up the rook on g8. If he takes with the bishop, we fork the king and rook. So he has to play king to e6. A very nice maneuver by Lev, protecting the pawn tactically. Okay, so black has managed to get his king to the middle of the board. This is better, right? Well, as it turns out, white's position is so dominating, he just merely switches gears a tiny, tiny bit, and he starts to encapsulate the black king. Bishop c7, knight to d7, knight to e3, knight to c5, and rook to d5. And this is actually a bit of a mistake by Lev, but it's still winning. Like I said, there are so many roads that lead to Rome here that you almost cannot go wrong with white. But let's take a look at what I thought was the best move, was rook h to e1. I just wanted to have something to back up the center, that if black ever tried f5, he can't do it, of course. But if say he played bishop h6 and wanted to trade on e3, he might try f5 and free up his game. The problem, going back here, the problem with the move rook to d5 is it hangs the e pawn. And I think Lev thought he had a tactical way out of this, but let's take a look at what happens on rook h to e1. if he goes knight takes e4 here, now we go d7, and he can go bishop c5. This is probably the best. You know, moving the rook over is just not going to get the job done. Because if he goes to d8, we just take the rook and we're winning. If he moves to a8, we can play d8 with a knight and force him to take the pawn, which is now a knight. So we're winning material if he just does that. So bishop c5 is the best shot. And now promote to a queen, rook takes. And black has complicated matters, but he's too far behind in material here. He cannot possibly hope to hold this. So back here after rook h e1, rook g7 might be the best idea to keep the pawn from moving forward. Knight to c4, overprotecting the pawn and protecting the e-pawn directly with the rook on e1. Rook h7, knight to b6, rook to e8, now b4, chasing that knight back, and now knight to c4. And white maintains a strong positional edge and a bind on black's position over the entire board. You know, white would have to fight on here and continue improving his position. But that's the whole point of this game. Move by move by move, white is able to do something to improve his position, whereas move by move by move, black cannot. Black is stuck. He doesn't have any way to improve things. So let's get back to the game and where rook to d5 was played. Now Eli, I'm not sure again what the time situation was, but he makes a mistake and he plays knight to d7. This is a shame because he did have a chance here to play knight takes e4. And this is not so clear. I think what Lev was figuring on doing here was simply to play d7, right? Looks crushing. It really does. It looks crushing. But bishop to h6. Okay, we're going to have to give up a rook. But we're going to get some play here in the meanwhile. So we take with check. Rook takes. And now f3. The problem here for white is that he has two pieces hanging. He has the rook on d5, which is tacitly hanging because bishop takes e3 is a threat. And the bishop on c7 is hanging. So f3 is probably the best try. Bishop takes e3, pawn takes, then rook takes on c7, rook to d8, rook to c4. Okay. I am no longer sure that white can score this point. He's up the exchange, but that pawn on e4 is going to fall, and it's not very easy. I think that, yes, white can swing over and win the h-pawn real quick, and black's going to get some play with rook takes e4 and bishop to d5. Is it enough? I don't know. I think I'm not sure who I would prefer here. So this is definitely the path that Eli missed. And again, this is probably the biggest reason why this couldn't get the game of the week, other than lack of queens. So knight to d7 was played in the game, and Lev is back in the driver's seat after knight to f5. Disaster averted. Now, Lev takes this to the full submission game. He goes for a chokehold, if you will. Rook h8, rook h to d1. Again, we are in that battle of white will just make moves to improve his position while black can only sit back and watch. So these don't need much explanation. White is just going for expansion on the queen side. Now, knight to e7 was a good move here. I saw this when I was roughly going through the game after the game had finished. I didn't see it during the game, but afterwards I looked at it, and then surprisingly when I ran Houdini on it later on, it thought it was a good move. Well, here's the idea. He did not play this, but had he played knight to e7, well, it's hitting a rook. Right, so something's got to be done. Rook to a8. If he takes, then we can take back, and we're hitting a knight there, and if he goes knight to f7, we can still play rook to d8 and promote the pawn. So this is just crushing. So rook a8, rook 5 to d3, rook h8, knight d5, bishop g7, knight to b6, hitting the rook again, rook a5, and now after rook d5, protecting the b pawn, f5, knight to d7. Surprising move. Moving the knight en prise, but more importantly, threatening knight to c5 check, and bishop takes rook on a5. So two threats that are hard to deal with. So again, white has used some tactical means to improve his position. Going back to the game though, king to b2 was played by Lev. It's a fine move. Rook to d7, king to b3, improving the king position. Black plays knight to f7. Now, all the commentators and the people in the chat room, myself included, thought that f4 was the way to go here. Lev decided to play rook 1 to d2 to try and gain more time on the clock. It's one of the things that you want to do, and it actually pays off here, and it's a good rule of thumb, if you will, to remember. When you have the better position in an endgame, and you have moves that don't do anything but don't allow your opponent to improve, then play those moves, even if it makes the game stretch out. There's a psychological reason to that. Your opponent will start thinking, well, this guy can play anything. I'm completely hopeless here. And then they will in turn blunder. All right. The thing is that he had a better move here. He had f4. Now, can I condemn rook 1 to d2 over this move? Not really, because Lev is following a well-known standard practice in superior endgame technique. But f4, let's look at this. Now, the first thing to note is that e takes f4 is not possible to this very pretty mate, knight to d4. The chokehold is complete. So, g takes f3, has to be tried. G takes f3, and if he didn't trade, this similar line would happen here. Now, rook e8 and then f4. So if he didn't trade and he played rook to e8 right away, we'd just play f4. So we'd have the extra pawns on the board, no big difference here. And the point here is if he takes again on f4, boom, we still have that choke mate. And if knight to h6, then we go f takes e5, f takes e5, and knight to e3. And white should be able to win this rather easily. Now the files have opened up on the king side for the white rook, and once he infiltrates there, the power of the pawn on d6 will be felt immensely. One comical note here is that someone mentioned that Lev should have played rook 1 d4. Now this is hope chess. Okay, you can't really do this. The idea here is if e takes d4, we get to see that mate in a rather quicker fashion. And if Eli had thought that Lev had simply done a mouse slip, yeah, he may have taken it, given how low on time he was. But, come on, you can't play like that. Simply, black would play knight takes d6 and just get rid of that nasty pawn once and for all. Here, after rook takes d6, rook takes, now he has to take with the rook. Bishop takes d6, and now rook to c1. And the thing here is that the black rook gets very active going after the kingside pawns. White has the knight and the bishop versus the rook, but this is not a way you want to go down. Not when you are just dominating the position. Okay, so that was all fun and games. f4 was the best shot, but rook 1 to d2, rook to a8. Black is still all sorts of tied up. And there is little he can do to stop white from, at least for one, right now, gaining time on the clock, which is what Lev is doing, and then improving his position when he has more time to think and formulate a plan. So rook to d1 was played, and rook to c8 and f3. All right, Lev is back on track. gf3, rook a8. Now f4 right away is probably the right way to go. Again, with all those threats we saw in the previous variation. But Rook 5 to d3 was played, and watching Lev play this game is like watching Eric Clapton lay down a nice guitar solo. And as a matter of fact, both players could be called slow hand. Rook c8, Rook 1 to d2. And now, finally, the frustration level in Black's mind reaches a boiling point. And I'm sure that he was upset that moving the rook between c8 and a8 wasn't accomplishing anything. It's really the best he could do. White would then have to create some sort of plan, which I think would still involve rook to g2 at some point and trying to infiltrate through g8. But he'd have to do that on his own volition. But now, after bishop to h6, which Eli played in the game, rook to g2. And again, f4 may have been the better move. Let's take a look at this. Well, first of all, if he plays bishop takes f4, well, now we get a rear naked chokehold with knight to g7, checkmate. Beautiful. And if bishop to f8, what do you do here? This is one of the, let me give you a hint. One of the important aspects of what you do is that you have a pawn on f4. Alright, I hope you looked at this. If you haven't got it yet, pause it and find out. But we're going to continue on here. The move is knight to g7. Bam! And now he's stuck in an armbar with f5 mate. Beautiful stuff, beautiful patterns. And lastly, if e takes f4 here, then we have rook to d5, and what is a mate threat here? Yeah, knight to d4. Well, he can stop it by creating luft. But let's look at how he can create luft. If he moves the knight to give f7 to the king, he loses the bishop. Boom. If he moves the rook, then we trade, and then we come here, and then if knight takes d6, we get the bishop, so c2, no, I'm sorry, bishop f8, and now we're at c7, and now mate on d4 absolutely cannot be stopped. If knight to e5, we still can pick up the bishop. So any move that creates luft here is going to give up material. So in the game he played rook to g2, and after bishop to f8, the best move here for black is probably rook takes bishop. Whoops. It's probably rook takes bishop. D takes rook check, king to c2. And now the problem for black is he can't defend that pawn from promoting and his rook on d3. Winning for white. But that might well have been his best shot. In the game he played bishop f8. And Lev was very quick to play rook to g8. Now the threat here is simply rook takes f8 and then knight to g7 with the rear naked chokehold. Full submission. Now, bishop takes d6 was played, but there's a couple of options here. If he had tried knight takes d6, then we got knight takes, rook takes c7, rook takes f8, rook takes d6. Now we just go into a simplified winning rook and pawn ending. Rook takes f6, king takes, and then rook takes rook. White's a pawn up, and it's a very simple ending. White should have no problem converting this point. Instead, he took with the bishop on d6. And now the commentators got a chuckle because Lev now played knight to g7 check. The very cut and dried version of this we all saw in the chat room, and the commentator saw this as well. It was rook takes rook, rook takes bishop, oops, rook takes d6 is check. He can take here. Now we take the rook, and okay, this is an easy win for white. So that's what we all saw. But Lev played knight to g7 check. Still just gaining a few seconds on the clock. Actually got a full minute out of those two moves. And now he plays it. And if he tries knight to g5, you know, to get out of the mate, of course we can just play rook takes, rook here check, king f7, knight takes d6. And black gets mated soon. you know, taking the piece on g5 makes no sense when you have mate coming. So he did play rook takes c7, and now Lev played rook to e8. Again, more chuckles from the commentators. They thought rook takes d6, knight takes, rook takes was the easiest winning path again. Okay, rook e8 check, king d7, and rook to e7. This is how Lev's mind works. Very pretty line. King to d8, rook takes f7, and black, feeling the need for a good stiff drink and knowing that they didn't serve it there where he was playing at, decided to resign and head to the bar. I don't know where he went, but if I had lost a game like this, I would definitely have a hefty bar tab to contend with the next day. This was actually the last decisive game of the match that gave Arizona the victory for the match. Amanda won her game. Robbie lost his game to Goldenberg. What an exciting game. That was full of flaws, but very exciting nonetheless. And I'll post that in the blog. I hope you look at it. It's a very fun game. And then on board one, there was a draw between Thunderholt and Mackenzie Molnar. Conrad's a strong player, and so is Mackenzie. So we kind of figured that may have ended up being a draw. All right, mad props to Lev for this game. That's an absolutely beautiful game. One of my all-time favorites now. I mean, just sit there with a chessboard and take the notes and go over it. It's just so beautiful, the geometry in this game. And I hope you will enjoy reading the blog and leave comments. Let me know if I'm doing a good job or a sucky job, whatever. I appreciate the feedback and the support. Until next time, good luck.